The movie begins on February 8th, 1977. Tony Kuritzis drives his car while listening to his favorite radio DJ, Fred Temples. He arrives at Meridian Mortgage Company, but his car key breaks in the ignition. He then enters the company building with a cardboard box in his hand. Inside, he notices that the woman who usually sits at the front desk, Barb, is not there. He asks if she is new. The receptionist replies yes and asks how she can help him. Tony says he has a meeting with ML Hall. The woman tells him to wait while she calls to confirm. After a few moments, she apologizes and says that ML Hall is currently in Florida. Tony insists that he has a meeting scheduled for today. She confirms that the meeting is still set, but it will be handled by his son, Richard Hall. Richard comes out and apologizes, saying his father had to leave for a last-minute business trip. Tony is angry and says his father is avoiding him on purpose. Richard tries to calm him down and assures him that they will figure everything out. He offers to take him to the conference room that Tony prefers. They take the elevator to the hall and meet Barb there. Tony notices her and makes a brief comment. Richard asks if they can use the conference room and Barb agrees. The two men go inside. Tony says he wants to close the door for privacy, and Richard agrees. Tony's eyes fall on a family photograph, and he comments on the picture, saying Richard has a pretty little family. He then begins unboxing the cardboard box and hands a large plan to Richard, asking him to place it on the table. When Richard opens the plan, he is confused. Instead of land documents, he sees images and diagrams of a shotgun. As he turns around, he finds Tony pointing a pistol at him. Richard is stunned, believing they were there to discuss land matters. Tony tells him he is serious and says he plans to expose what the company has done to him. He forces Richard to turn around and attaches a dead man's wire connected to a shotgun around his neck, taking him hostage. Tony calls 911 himself and calmly states that he is holding a hostage. He explains that he has attached a shotgun device around a man's neck. He adds that he is not insane, just angry at what the company has done to him. He asks Richard to write down the full address and gives it to the operator. He clearly warns that if anyone grabs him or pulls the gun, the man will die. Richard asks Tony what his plan is. Tony says he plans to go to his house. However, his car key broke earlier, so they will have to use Richard's car instead. Richard explains that his car is parked on Earl Street, near a shop where he buys sugar-free muffins. Tony suggests they walk. Richard hesitates, saying they do not need to create a bigger scene. Tony points out the window and shows him that it is already a scene, as police cars begin arriving outside. Tony then escorts Richard downstairs. Officers surround the building, watching every movement carefully. The atmosphere is tense and chaotic. Tony warns the police not to interfere as he walks past them with Richard under his control. As the situation escalates and more officers gather, the news quickly begins to spread. Word of a hostage situation on Market Street reaches local media. Reporter Linda receives a call about heavy police activity and immediately sees it as a major breaking story. She heads toward the scene with her cameraman. As Tony and Richard walk toward Earl Street, a police officer named Mike Grappel arrives in his patrol car. While speaking on the phone, Mike asks if this is Tony Kuritzis from 8th and Rural. He quickly realizes who he is dealing with. When Mike steps out of the car, Tony immediately orders him to keep his hands where he can see them. Mike introduces himself calmly and says he is not armed. He tells Tony that they know each other. Tony recognizes him and says it is good to see him, even telling Richard that he knows the officer personally. Mike suggests that they move somewhere calm to talk. Tony refuses and says they are getting into Richard's car on Earl Street. Mike responds that other officers will not allow that. At that moment, Linda arrives with her cameraman and begins recording. The situation becomes more intense when another police car pulls up. A new officer steps out and points his gun toward Tony. Tony shouts, and Mike quickly tells the officer to lower his weapon. In the tension, Tony slips slightly, but the weapon does not discharge. Realizing the situation is escalating, Tony changes his plan. He demands the keys to the newly arrived police car. The officer hesitates, but Mike tells him to hand them over. Tony announces that he is going to his apartments and says the police can follow if they need directions. He then gets into the patrol car with Richard, and they begin driving. Linda watches everything unfold in disbelief. She calls her newsroom and reports that this is not a robbery but a hostage situation. The person on the other end thanks her for the update and tells her to return, saying a larger team will take over. Linda refuses. She says she knows where they are headed and insists she will report it live. She ends the call and heads toward the Crestwood apartments. Richard drives the police car while Tony sits beside him, keeping full control of the situation. Several police cars follow closely behind, increasing the tension. Inside the car, Tony briefly talks about radio shows and mentions that he personally likes Fred Temples. The conversation feels strange and out of place considering the danger. Richard barely responds, focused on the road and clearly shaken. As they continue driving, Tony tells Richard that soon the whole world will know how dishonest his father and the company are. They arrive at Tony's apartment building. Police surround the area. Tony speaks to the officers through the intercom and claims the apartment is rigged and dangerous. He demands that he and Richard be allowed inside safely. The police hesitate but eventually allow them to enter, keeping the standoff alive. Inside the apartment, Tony makes Richard sit down. He removes the device from his neck and rearranges it. He positions the shotgun so it is aimed directly at Richard's face and secures it tightly to a fixed point. He warns Richard that he is also holding a pistol and that any sudden movement will trigger the weapon. Tony then ties Richard firmly to a chair, tightening the restraints carefully. While listening to Fred Temples's radio show in the background, he suddenly asks Richard if he wants milk. Richard quietly says yes. Tony helps him drink, holding the glass to his mouth. After a while, Tony asks Richard if he seems like a bad host. He gestures to the device and says he practiced for a week to make sure it works. Meanwhile, Linda reports live as police evacuate residents from the Crestwood apartments. As she continues filming, Mike approaches her and tells her to step back because the situation is dangerous. Linda asks whether the reports about explosives inside the apartment are true. Mike responds that the police are taking necessary precautions. Linda continues pressing him with questions, but Mike avoids giving direct answers and instructs her to stay behind the barricade before walking away. Soon, Chief Gallagher arrives at the scene and takes control of the operation. He calls Tony while Tony is angrily ranting to Richard about how his father betrayed him. Tony answers the call and clearly states his demands. He wants a written agreement from Meridian Mortgage and the county clerk's office. He demands that his debt be forgiven and that he receive financial compensation. He also insists that he walk out as a free man, with no jail time and no psychiatric evaluation. After stating his terms, he ends the call. After the call, Richard says the handcuffs are too tight. Tony reacts angrily at first, saying he does not have the keys. A moment later, he calms down and apologizes. He tells Richard that he will allow him to speak to his family later. Richard agrees. As the news continues broadcasting the situation and Tony's story on television, Richard is allowed to speak to his wife on the phone. While Richard talks to her, Tony interrupts and tells him to convey his apology to his family for putting them through this hostage situation. Richard passes on the message, says he will stay in touch, and then ends the call. After a while, Tony receives another call from Chief Gallagher. The chief tells him that he made a good decision by allowing Richard to speak to his family. He then informs Tony that his brother Jimmy is on the way. Hearing this, Tony becomes visibly excited. Gallagher also explains that George Maltz, the deputy prosecutor, is present to handle the legal process since James Kelly is out of town. Tony reacts when he hears that a prosecutor is involved, but Gallagher assures him that it is only part of the official procedure. He then connects Tony with the prosecutor. The prosecutor informs Tony that an agreement has been arranged by the company. Tony immediately asks about the apology. The prosecutor tells him to turn to Channel 9. On television, Clifford Chapman, a finance representative for Meridian Mortgage, appears and delivers a public apology on behalf of the company, stating that it is authorized by M.L. Hall. Tony becomes furious. He says he does not want an apology from a representative. He demands a direct apology from M.L. Hall himself. Only then, he says, will he release Richard. He ends the call, still angry, insisting that he wants the truth to be heard by the public and the world. Tony calls radio station and asks to speak with Fred Temples. Fred's assistant, James, takes the call and informs Fred, who agrees to speak with Tony. Tony begins by saying he is a long-time listener and a first-time caller. He asks whether the call is live on air, and Fred tells him it is being recorded. Tony then angrily explains how Meridian Mortgage ruined his life. He asks Fred what he would do in his position. Fred replies that he would be angry. Tony presses further, asking if he would kill them. Fred avoids encouraging him and instead tries to calm him. Fred eventually stops the recording and tells Tony he will air it after consulting with authorities. Tony thanks him. After the call, Tony takes Richard to the bathroom and makes him lie in the bathtub for the night. He tells him good night and leaves him there under control. Meanwhile, Fred contacts the authorities and informs them about the recorded conversation. Officers explain that Tony is no longer speaking directly to them and ask if Fred would be willing to act as a bridge. Fred agrees, wanting to help keep everyone safe. The officers then say a federal agent will be assigned to assist. Morning begins with the radio airing Tony's recorded interview from the previous night. Tony goes to the bathroom and says good morning to Richard. He sounds excited and tells him that the interview is now on air. He says that Fred and many listeners seem to be on his side. Suddenly, Tony hears news that a bomb squad unit is arriving at the apartment building. He panics and runs to the window, shouting for them to go away. He quickly calls Fred and demands that he tell the authorities to pull back the bomb squad. He also asks for live news coverage to continue. Fred informs the authorities about Tony's reaction. Meanwhile, a federal agent arrives at the scene and introduces himself. He discusses the case with the officers and asks about Tony's psychological condition. After reviewing the situation, they decide that Tony should speak directly with M.L. Hall. Chief Gallagher then calls Tony and tells him that M.L. Hall is on the line. M.L. first asks to speak with his son. Tony hands the phone to Richard. His father asks if he is okay, and Richard says he is. Richard also asks about his mother, and then tells his father that the only way to end this situation is to apologize to Tony. He explains that Tony believes the company unfairly increased interest and caused financial damage. However, M.L. Hall refuses to apologize. He says the call is being recorded and that he will not apologize for something he believes he did not do. Tony snatches the phone and demands an apology for ruining his life. Hall still refuses. He coldly says that a man who only feeds his own mouth is no man at all. He claims he has empathy and even believes in Tony's vision, but he will not apologize. Tony angrily replies that they had been ready to sign the deal, but it was made to fall through because they wanted his land, and that all he wants is a simple apology. Hall remains firm. Furious, Tony asks what would happen if he shot Richard right now. Without emotion, Hall says he would mourn his son. Then he ends the call. Meanwhile, Linda approaches Jimmy and introduces herself as a reporter from Channel 12. She asks how he knows Frank Love. Jimmy replies that he has known him since childhood. When Linda looks confused, Jimmy reveals that he is Tony Caritas' brother. Jimmy says the media has portrayed Tony unfairly. He insists Tony is not desperate and does not want millions of dollars, as some reports claim. He explains that they have a personal attorney named John, who will handle the matter properly. Back at the apartment, Richard says he wants to rest. Tony tells him this will not be over soon. As usual, he places Richard in the bathtub for the night. Richard prays and falls asleep while Tony stays awake watching television. During the night, Richard dreams of hearing a gunshot and chaos outside the room. He calls for help. The door opens and Tony stands there covered in blood. It is only a nightmare. Thursday begins inside the apartment. While feeding his fish, Tony asks Richard if he has any pets. Richard says he owns a golden retriever. Tony jokes that Sparky will be fine because his family will feed it. Richard corrects him and says the dog's name is Max, named after Maxville Lake. Tony notes that the lake belongs to his father and sarcastically guesses he owns a boat too. Richard admits that he does. The conversation turns serious. Tony points out that Richard seems to have everything in life. Richard responds that although he is financially supported, his life is not all sunshine and rainbows. He refers to the tense call with his father the previous day. Tony suddenly shifts the mood, turns on the radio, and starts dancing. Richard laughs, and the tension briefly softens. Meanwhile, Fred Temples receives calls from listeners who describe Tony as a good man and praise his courage. Fred announces that part of the proposed agreement may include Tony speaking during a live news broadcast. Police finalize safety measures and carefully position officers in case anything goes wrong. They also arrange for Fred to remain visible to Tony during the broadcast so he feels heard and stays calm. When the live news conference is ready, Mike informs Tony at the door. Richard, desperate, asks if it is finally over and begs to be uncuffed. Instead, Tony places the shotgun apparatus back around his neck. Richard refuses to appear like that on live television, but Tony warns him that he will shoot if he does not cooperate. As they prepare to step outside, a written statement from M.L. Hall arrives. Tony orders Richard to take it and read it aloud during the live broadcast. When everything is ready, they enter the studio for the live broadcast. Tony orders Richard to read the statement, but angrily grabs it and reads it himself. The statement agrees to the terms and reflects what Tony demanded. He then thanks Fred Temples and says that without the radio broadcast, people would have seen him only as a kidnapper. The live conference ends. Tony and Richard return to the room where Jimmy and others wait. The attorney confirms the deal, and Tony signs the agreement. As Mike carefully removes the gun and wire from Richard, Tony suddenly grabs the gun, fires it upward, and shouts that they thought it was not loaded. Officers immediately restrain and arrest him. Chief Kurtz later confirms that Richard is safe and the deal is complete. Richard reunites with his wife, while Tony is placed in a police car. On October 25, 1977, the jury finds Tony not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict disappoints Richard, Fred, and the officers involved.